In World War II, one of the most intense debates between Allied forces wasn't over battle lines or tanks. It was over how to bomb Nazi Germany. Specifically, when the Americans insisted on bombing by daylight, the British, they refused. They bombed at night. And that disagreement wasn't a minor tactical note, it shaped the entire Allied bombing campaign, defined massive military decisions, cost thousands of lives, and changed how war was fought from the air. If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your feedback helps shape what we cover next, and you being here keeps the conversation going. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. The divide came down to doctrine. The British Royal Air Force, led by Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, was convinced that nighttime area bombing was the most effective path. Harris believed in destroying entire cities, targeting urban centers to demoralize the German population and force the Nazis to divert resources away from the front lines. His strategy was destruction through saturation firebombing, mass civilian disruption, citywide chaos. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, American commanders had a completely different vision. Their doctrine focused on daylight precision bombing, and they believed it could end the war faster and with more efficiency. Led by General Ira Eaker, the U.S. Army Air Forces argued for striking at the heart of the German war machine factories, oil refineries, and transportation hubs with pinpoint accuracy. The plan? Cripple Germany's ability to make war, rather than simply burning cities to the ground. This difference wasn't philosophical fluff, it caused real friction, and it reached a boiling point at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943. That's where Roosevelt, Churchill, and their top commanders sat down to figure out how to move forward. Churchill backed the British approach. After all, the RAF had years of experience bombing at night and saw it as the safest and most effective method. British bombers simply couldn't survive daylight raids, not against the intensity of German anti-aircraft guns and fighter planes. But the Americans, especially Eaker, weren't ready to back down. They believed so deeply in the idea of daylight precision that they were willing to put their own bomber crews in extreme danger. Eaker told Churchill, bluntly, to give us the tools, and we will finish the job. The compromise? Both sides would continue their respective strategies: daylight precision by the Americans, night area bombing by the British in a coordinated campaign. So the Americans launched their raids, and the results were brutal. Take the Schweinfurt and Regensburg missions. These were key industrial targets, ball-bearing factories and aircraft production plants essential to the German war effort. The raids hit hard, but the costs? Even harder. Losses on these missions reached over 20%. Hundreds of American airmen were killed, captured, or wounded in just a single day. Entire bomber groups were decimated before even reaching their targets. At the time, American bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress were flying deep into enemy territory without adequate fighter escort. The idea was that heavy bomber formations, loaded with machine guns, could defend themselves. But German fighters weren't impressed. They attacked in waves, using head-on tactics and concentrated formations that tore through American bombers. The Luftwaffe's defenses adapted fast. German commanders dispersed their industries, moved critical production underground, and altered tactics. They created massive flak belts around cities and key routes. They poured resources into defending their skies. Every American daylight raid was met with increasingly sophisticated and deadly resistance. Meanwhile, the British continued their night campaigns. Harris' strategy resulted in massive firebombings of cities like Hamburg and Dresden. But for the Americans, something had to change. The bomber losses were unsustainable, and the game changer came in the form of long-range escort fighters, specifically the P-51 Mustang. Once these aircraft were introduced, everything shifted. With P-51s able to escort bombers all the way to their targets and back, the playing field began to even out. The Luftwaffe couldn't match the new air power. By mid-1944, American bombers were flying deeper, hitting harder, and returning in greater numbers. The losses dropped. Precision raids became more effective. By the time of the D-Day invasion, The Allies had achieved clear air superiority. German fighters were overwhelmed, their fuel and aircraft production crippled by the very bombing raids the Americans had insisted on. Thousands of Allied bomber crews died. Missions had over 10% casualty rates, and some airmen didn't survive even a handful of flights. For civilians in German cities, the terror was constant fire, destruction, and death rained down from above, often indiscriminately. And that's where the moral complexity enters. Was it justified? Supporters argue yes, strategic bombing shortened the war, saved Allied ground troops, and destroyed critical infrastructure. But critics highlight the civilian toll, the immense suffering, and the targeting of entire cities with limited military value. If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your feedback helps shape what we cover next, and you being here keeps the conversation going. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. The debate over whether area bombing was ethical continues to this day. What's clear is that both strategies, American daylight raids and British night bombing, were born from different philosophies, different technologies, and different war experiences. The Americans bet on technology, precision, and boldness. The British bet on survival, experience, and mass effect. Neither side was fully right. Neither side was fully wrong. But together, the combined force of Allied air power cracked open the German war effort, and it redefined the role of air warfare in modern combat. The Americans didn't just want to win the war, they wanted to prove that air power alone could change the course of history. That doctrine shaped how wars would be fought for decades to come. It wasn't just about bombs, it was about proving that the sky could decide the future. Behind the stats and the strategies were people. Young men flying into enemy territory knowing the odds were stacked against them. Civilians in cities turned to rubble, caught in the firestorms. Leaders making impossible decisions with incomplete information. And an entire world watching to see whether strategic bombing would succeed or collapse under its own weight. It didn't collapse. It endured. It evolved. And it worked at a staggering cost. This is the story of that choice. The story of why Americans bombed by day, of why the British refused, and how that divide, born out of disagreement, ended up becoming a devastatingly effective partnership. Thanks for sticking with this look into one of World War I's most consequential decisions. If this gave you a new perspective on history, give it a like. Share it with someone who loves diving into the details of what really won the war. Subscribe for more stories that look past the headlines and into the complexity beneath. And let us know in the comments, do you think the costs of strategic bombing were justified by its results? The debate may never end, but the impact, it changed history forever. Let's go further, because this wasn't just a tactical disagreement or a military footnote. This was a full-scale philosophical clash between two of the most powerful air forces in the world, happening in real time, in the middle of the most destructive war in human history. The British had already lived through the worst of the Blitz. Their cities had burned, their civilians had died in the thousands, and their bombers had been torn apart in earlier daylight missions. They had learned the hard way that flying during the day meant flying into death. So when Arthur Harris, head of RAF Bomber Command, committed to night bombing, it wasn't just for strategic impact. It was about survivability. He believed the goal wasn't to strike only precise military targets, but to erode Germany's will to fight, to make the price of war too high for the German people. And with raids like the one on Hamburg in 1943, he proved just how devastating this could be. Operation Gomorrah unleashed firestorms that destroyed large sections of the city and killed over 40,000 civilians. It was horror on an industrial scale. But to Harris, that was the point. He believed in shock, in psychological collapse. If Germany's cities were burned to ash, how could their war machine keep running? To the Americans, this approach bordered on madness. They didn't just disagree tactically, they found it morally questionable. General Karl Spaatz, General Henry Hap Arnold, and General Ira Eaker believed that bombing could be done surgically, scientifically. They were convinced that with the right tools, like the highly touted Norden bombsight, they could drop bombs straight into factory courtyards from 25,000 feet. And with enough precision, they could break the enemy's ability to fight, without targeting civilians en masse. That idealism came at a staggering price. Because the bomb sight didn't account for flak, or wind, or enemy fighters, or the chaos of combat, and American bomber crews paid for every assumption with their lives. The missions over Schweinfurt and Regensburg were textbook examples of both bravery and brutal reality. These were raids aimed at the beating heart of German industry, and they worked. Schweinfurt's ball-bearing production took a serious hit, but the losses were catastrophic. Out of hundreds of bombers that launched, dozens were shot down. Some units lost nearly a third of their men. Planes came back shredded, limping across the channel. Others never came back at all, and still, the Americans insisted on pressing forward. They had to, because they weren't just fighting Germany, they were fighting for their doctrine. If daylight precision bombing failed, it would call into question the entire foundation of American air power. And more than that, it would jeopardize their efforts to establish the Air Force as a dominant, independent military branch. So they doubled down. And the only way to survive those deep daylight raids was to solve one huge problem: range. The bombers needed escorts. But early fighters like the P-47 and P-38 couldn't make it all the way to Germany and back. That left the bombers exposed in the most dangerous stretch of sky deep inside enemy territory. That's where the P-51 Mustang came in. With its long range, high speed, and maneuverability, the P-51 changed everything. Suddenly, bombers had guardians. Fighters could stay with them the whole way. German interceptors, once confident in attacking unprotected bomber streams, now found themselves on the defensive. This was the turning point. By early 1944, the combination of bombers and long-range fighters began to tilt the balance. German aircraft production was under siege. Fuel plants were burning. Transportation systems were fractured. And critically, the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, was bleeding pilots faster than it could replace them. The Americans called it the Big Week, a massive, coordinated bombing offensive in February 1944 that shattered aircraft factories and drew the Luftwaffe into battles it couldn't afford to lose. The skies over Germany were filled with smoke, wreckage, and fire. And for the first time, Allied bombers could break through with fewer losses and greater results. Meanwhile, the British kept hammering German cities at night. Dresden, Berlin, Cologne. The list of firebombed cities grew. Civilian casualties soared. Controversy followed then and now. Critics called it indiscriminate. Others called it necessary. To the British, the goal was simple: break Germany's ability and desire to wage war. But as Allied air dominance grew, the two strategies began to converge. American bombers, still committed to precision, benefited from reduced German air defenses. British night bombers, now bolstered by better navigation and radar, became more accurate. And by mid-1944, with both air forces operating in tandem, the combined impact was staggering. Railways were crippled. Factories were silent. Oil was running out. The German war economy was on the verge of collapse. And by the time D-Day arrived, Allied air power had done what many thought impossible: it had established control over the skies of Europe. That control didn't just help the invasion succeed. It protected supply lines. It paralyzed German troop movement. It allowed for relentless follow-up attacks as the Allies pushed deeper into France and beyond. And by 1945, the bombing campaign reached its crescendo. The destruction was undeniable. German morale was shattered. Cities were rubble. Industry was paralyzed. Even Hitler's inner circle knew that the war was slipping away, not just because of ground losses, but because the skies belonged to the Allies. Still, the cost was unbearable. Tens of thousands of Allied airmen were lost. Many were never found. Civilians in Germany, most of them not Nazi officials or military personnel, died in firestorms that consumed entire neighborhoods. Children, families, workers, all caught in the relentless bombing campaigns. The question lingers: was it worth it? It's easy to moralize in hindsight, but at the time, leaders faced impossible decisions. Every raid was weighed against the nightmare of a longer war. Every civilian death was calculated brutally against the hope of a faster end. This was total war, and in total war, every target becomes a means to an end. What emerged from all this wasn't just victory, it was a new doctrine. Strategic bombing had proven its worth, not just in damaging the enemy, but in reshaping how wars would be fought for generations. After the war, the U.S. Army Air Forces became the United States Air Force, its own branch, with global reach and strategic purpose. Precision bombing became central to American military identity. The British, having relied so heavily on area bombing, faced more criticism, but their contribution was never in doubt. They had held the line when few others could, and they helped bring Nazi Germany to its knees. In the end, it wasn't one approach or the other. It was both. The British brought fire and fury by night. The Americans brought steel and accuracy by day. Together, they forged a path through the sky, and it led straight to victory. Because the question of why Americans bombed by day and why the British refused wasn't just about tactics. It was about belief, about strategy, about shaping the future of warfare, and about a grim, calculated hope that from above, the war could be ended faster, and fewer would have to die on the ground. Let's be clear, this wasn't clean. It wasn't surgical. No amount of doctrine or strategic theory could mask the brutal reality of what was happening in the skies over Europe. For every debate in a war room, there were men inside a B-17, freezing at 25,000 feet, watching flak burst around them like black shrapnel flowers. There were British crews navigating through pitch-dark skies, knowing they'd never even see the German fighters hunting them. There were families in Cologne, Hamburg, Dresden huddled in basements, praying they wouldn't be burned alive in a firestorm they never asked for. The war in the air was as unforgiving as any battlefield. The difference was, it didn't leave trenches, it left cities in ashes. And yet, this is where the uncomfortable truth lives. The bombing campaign, for all its horror, worked. Germany's factories were shattered. Transportation routes were paralyzed. Oil supplies dried up. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Hitler's military machine, was decimated. By the time Allied troops marched across France, they weren't fighting panzer divisions backed by elite air cover. They were fighting a crippled army, drained of fuel, equipment, and willpower. The skies had been won, but not without a price that still haunts history. The split between American and British strategy never fully healed. Even after the war, both sides defended their choices. The Americans pointed to the precision of their attacks despite the early failures, despite the staggering losses, as proof of discipline, technological progress, and long-term effectiveness. The British stood by their belief that the destruction of cities shattered morale, forced mass evacuations, and diluted Nazi control. They were both right. They were both wrong. That's what makes this chapter of World War II so complex. It's not a clean victory story. It's a grim calculus of ethics, technology, sacrifice, and power. And it reshaped how wars are fought even today. The bombers may be quieter now, the weapons more advanced, the strategies refined, but the same questions echo through every modern military decision. What is the cost of air power? What does precision really mean? And who pays the price when a doctrine becomes reality? So next time you hear about airstrikes or military strategy, remember this: the day versus night debate wasn't just about when to bomb. It was about how we define power, victory, and humanity when the world is on fire. If this helped you see that part of history in a new light, hit like, share it, and subscribe for more. And drop a comment: where do you stand on the legacy of strategic bombing? Because history doesn't just ask us what happened, it asks what we're going to do with what we now know.